I just want to begin by conveying my deep solidarity and condolences to you. I'm sure there are others listening today who also have lost loved ones in this tragedy, and I know that makes this so real and deeply painful for all of you. I also want to say at the outset that, in many ways, I have far less expertise and experience around the particularities of this tragedy than all of you, and I'm bringing, I suppose, my particular human rights perspective, but very much want to acknowledge and honor the deep expertise that so many others also have here. I mean, it goes without saying to begin that the downing of Flight 752 by Iranian Revolutionary Guards on January 8th, 2020, which killed all 172 people on board, was above all an unbelievably heartbreaking and senseless tragedy. And it's a tragedy that, of course, has devastated the families, loved ones, and friends and colleagues of those killed. And of course, we know it is a tragedy with a particularly strong and wrenching dimension for Canadians, given that those killed included 55 Canadian citizens, 30 Canadian permanent residents, and so many others with strong Canadian connections. And more than 18 months later, despite considerable international pressure, transparency about what happened that fateful night is still non-existent, as secrecy continues to shroud the truth and protect, in particular, those responsible for authorizing this missile attack that brought the plane down. 10 people have been indicted, but details about those charges are scant and have not been made public. Information that has been provided by Iranian authorities is lacking, it's inconsistent, it's contradictory, it's untrue, it's certainly incomplete. And the government's narrative largely continues to be that this was unfortunate human error, end of story. Meanwhile, foreign governments who are following this closely, certainly including Canada, but also Ukraine, Sweden, Afghanistan, the United Kingdom, and others, reject Iran's explanations and certainly reject the reliability of the Iranian investigation and are pressing for true accountability. And those governments who have worked closely with the families of those who were killed on PS 752 have made it clear to the Iranian government that must include such things as a meaningful public apology, a full accounting of the events that led to the downing of the flight, the return of victims' belongings, assurances of non-repetition, such as a comprehensive review of Iran's air defense system, transparency and independence in the criminal prosecutions, and certainly adequate and appropriate compensation. We know this is, rightly, a priority for the Canadian government and has occupied considerable attention, in particular for two ministers of foreign affairs, Minister Champagne last year and Minister Garneau this year. Canada continues to exert pressure on Iran bilaterally and multilaterally and has recently taken the very commendable step of appointing Professor Payam Akhavan, well known to and respected nationally and internationally, as a special advisor on this file, and that's, I think, particularly important as he is an accomplished and experienced international human rights lawyer, to go to our theme today of this being a human rights violation. And I guess that's the next point I want to make here. Importantly, we must understand and respond to the downing of PS 752 not only as the heartless and heartbreaking tragedy it is, not only through the politics, the political lens, the geopolitics, the tensions and the disputes that it has given rise to, but also to see it absolutely as another chapter in an illustration of decades, as Sarah reminded us in her opening, 42 years, in fact, of outright contempt for human rights by the Iranian government. In fact, the attack itself and so much of what has occurred in Iran in direct response to this terrible tragedy is precisely that, a range of grave, serious, and systematic human rights violations. And we see that now authoritatively documented in numerous and comprehensive investigations, reports, statements, and resolutions that have come forward from major international human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and from independent experts within the UN's human rights system. It has absolutely been situated as a human rights issue and must go forward as such. That includes concerns about the fact that in the immediate aftermath of the downing of the flight, there were, of course, courageous public protests within Iran. And Amnesty International at the time reported that authorities responded with unlawful and violent force in an effort to disperse those protests, which were all about Iran's responsibility for the shooting down of the flight. In fact, on January 11th and 12th of last year, authorities fired pointed pellets from air guns, which are usually used for hunting, at peaceful protesters, causing bleeding and painful injuries. Security forces used rubber bullets, tear gas, and pepper spray to disperse protesters. They kicked and punched protesters, beat them with batons, and carried out arbitrary arrests. Hardly a human rights informed response to a tragedy. Security and intelligence forces then maintained a heavy presence in a number of hospitals, raising fears that they were planning to arrest patients. Amnesty International reports receiving information that security forces tried to transfer some injured protesters to military hospitals. Some medical clinics and hospitals in Tehran, concerned about people's safety, turned away injured people, telling them that if the security and intelligence forces found out they were among the protesters, they would be arrested. So turning them away from hospitals in order to protect them from arbitrary arrest. In December, these concerns were reflected in the annual resolution about Iran's human rights record that is led by Canada at the UN General Assembly. That resolution, which is all about human rights, called on the Iranian government to, quote, cooperate with all relevant authorities on investigations into allegations of harassment and intimidation of some families of the victims of the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. That resolution, of course, was passed by the General Assembly. In February of this year, the UN Human Rights Council's Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions released the results of a comprehensive 6-month study documenting the multiple human rights violations associated with the downing of the flight. She was joined by the Council's Special Rapporteur on Iran in releasing that report. And the Special Rapporteur at Iran had also previously issued other statements and reports to both the Council and the UN General Assembly about the shooting down of the flight, the treatment of protesters, the treatment of family members on a number of occasions. So we see a pattern here growing over many months of the international community, the key organizations and institutions within the international human rights community, situating this absolutely as a human rights concern. And then 2 months ago, Human Rights Watch released an extensive report documenting the campaign of harassment and abuse that has been unleashed against the families of those who were killed. And that includes arbitrary detention, abusive interrogations, torture, and other mistreatment of family members. Security agencies have summoned, interrogated, or threatened to prosecute family members who criticized the government's handling of the incident. In at least one case, Human Rights Watch has documented authorities torturing a person and otherwise mistreating a family member who was taken into custody. In at least 3 cases, authorities threatened the families with consequences if they did not remove or kept up their social media posts critical of the government. So you see what's clear here. The irrefutable bottom line is that the shooting down of PS 752, the nature of the investigation since then, and the treatment of family members and protesters have all been marked by blatant, ongoing violations of Iran's international human rights obligations. And of course, I do not need to tell this audience, above all, that this very sadly does not in any way come as a surprise, because all of those human rights violations, all of those concerns about human rights abuses in connection with PS 752 are, of course, reflective of well-established, well-entrenched patterns over many decades now. This was not something new. This was, in many respects, more of the same. The list is long, but certainly includes all of the following: deeply ingrained in all aspects of how the authorities conduct themselves in Iran, and certainly now also very much part of the narrative of the PS 752 tragedy. Wholesale lack of accountability for unlawful actions of the Revolutionary Guards and other security forces. impunity, secrecy, denial, false information, mass killings, and callous disregard for life, violent dispersal of protests, repression of free expression, cruel targeting of family members who seek justice and accountability for what has happened to loved ones, massive numbers of arbitrary arrest and detention, widespread torture and mistreatment. The list could go on. That's a summary of many of the very serious human rights concerns in Iran over the last 42 years, and every single one of those applies to this tragedy. That climate of contempt for human rights has worsened once again with the assumption of Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency last month, a man who Amnesty International has publicly noted should be facing charges and trials for his direct responsibility for and involvement in massive human rights violations over these past decades, rather than rising to the highest level of power in the country. For instance, in a report in 2018, Amnesty International identified Ebrahim Raisi as a, quote, member of the Death Commission, which carried out the enforced disappearance and extrajudicial executions of several thousand political dissidents in Evin and Gohardasht prisons near Tehran in 1988. Those victims' bodies were mostly buried in unmarked mass graves. Amnesty has called for him to be criminally investigated for crimes against humanity of murder, enforced disappearance, and torture for those terrible incidents. Instead, he's the president of the country. Amnesty has also noted that after he was appointed as the head of the judiciary in March of 2019, that, quote, under his watch, the judiciary granted blanket impunity to government officials and security forces responsible for unlawful killing of hundreds of men, women, and children, and subjecting thousands of protesters to mass arrests, and at least hundreds of them to enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment during and in the aftermath of the nationwide protests in November of 2019. Again, the man responsible for that is now the man who rules Iran. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with this absolute truth that the struggle for justice for the victims of PS 752 and their family members is wrapped up in the wider struggle for human rights and freedom in Iran. That there are many human rights obligations at stake in those struggles, none more directly than Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Iran is a party. And Article 6 provides that, quote, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of their life. But the UN Human Rights Committee has noted that the right to life is the supreme right, in their words, from which no derogation is permitted, even in situations of armed conflict and other public emergencies. Well, that struggle for human rights and freedom in Iran is also, as we know, very much a struggle for human rights and freedom for Canadians. The downing of PS 752 is the most devastating example of the terrible toll that human rights violations committed by the Iranian regime has on Canadians, leading to the deaths of 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents. I think also of Canadian citizens and permanent residents who have endured the terror and agony of unjust imprisonment and torture in Iran, including Hamid Ghashemi-Shal, Homa Hudfar, Saeed Malikpour, Mustafa Azizi, Ramin Jahanbegloo, and many others. And with great sadness, I think of Zahra Kazemi and Kavus Sayed Emami, who died in their Iranian jail cells, both of them Canadian citizens. So this all comes together. This is a struggle for justice. It's a struggle for human rights. It's absolutely a struggle for human rights in Iran. It is also a Canadian human rights struggle. And thus, it is so important that the ongoing efforts to pursue answers, truth, accountability, and redress for this terrible crime continue on all fronts, in courtrooms, through diplomatic channels, at the UN, and that must always include every single possible human rights avenue: the UN Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, the UN Special Rapporteurs, and the UN Human Rights Treaty process. This is a struggle for human rights.